Tales from the Break Room is a viewer submission podcast, and I want you to send me your absolute scariest and true stories from work. Send them to me at eeriecast.com/submit, and if we narrate them on the show, we'll pay you 5 cents per word. But stories must be scary and believable, and we only pay through PayPal. Now, go rate Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. It's kind of like milk for podcasts, because it'll make us grow big and strong, unless this podcast is lactose intolerant.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Hey, good to have you back at the Dead and Roasted Cafe. The owner is telling me that they want to start selling some new kind of coffee bean. Apparently, it's the kind that's eaten by some sort of animal, then the animal passes it, if you know what I'm saying, and only then are the coffee beans usable. It's a real thing, look it up. I ain't letting no roast that dark come near my mouth. Speaking of high strangeness, I've got a set of new and scary work-related stories to share with you today, one of which features the most unsettling hiker and a very creeped-out park ranger. These are tales from the break room. Haunted Vault from FranBow. My hometown in England is very old. There are stories I could tell you about it that are very unsettling. Underneath most buildings in the town center, there are large stone vaults. I don't know what they used to be used for, but most of them have been repurposed for storage. It's especially useful for the bars, pubs, and clubs because it keeps alcohol chilled without the need for extra refrigeration. When I was 19, I got a job in a local club that had 4 bars attached to the premises. The staff took great pleasure in telling me stories of the vault under the club, which held the alcohol supply and extra glassware. Just from the tone they took, I was expecting to be sent down there and for something to happen. You know, haze in the newbie kind of jokes. Halfway through my first night, sure enough, I was asked to go into the vault to grab a specific bottle of champagne and 2 champagne glasses. To enter down into the vault, I had to take a back route out the club into a slabbed area and down an old-style hatch. The stairs were stone, but they'd been reworked to comply with the graded listing of the building and the health and safety of the business. The vault was extremely cold, even though we were in the middle of summer, and I understood why they used it to store the excess alcohol. I had goosebumps on my skin, and I was shivering before I even reached the area where the champagne was kept. The vaults are very dark. Due to the graded listing of the building, there's only certain types of lighting allowed to be built in and used. Many of the vaults had been upgraded, but the owner of this business did not want to spend the extra cash on something that wasn't absolutely necessary. As such, we used head-mounted torches to be able to see where we were going. I was just picking up the 2 glasses. I had turned to walk up the stairs when I heard shelves rattling behind me. I stopped briefly, and I shook my head with a laugh, or half a laugh rather. "Very funny," I said out loud, and continued out the vault, back up to the bar I was serving at that night. I put down the bottle and glasses with a smile. "Good one. Very good joke. You almost had me," I said to one of my coworkers who looked at me confused. "You know, the shaking shelves," I laughed. Not very scary though, to be honest. They continued to look at me and then shrugged, while another employee asked what I was talking about. I explained what had happened, and I smirked. I mean, it was a good joke. The second coworker went a little pale. "Nobody else is down there. Well, it must not like you." I laughed that off and kept on with my night. It wasn't until my 4th shift I realized they weren't playing jokes on me. I was helping to restock shelves with a delivery. I was in the vault alone. My boss was signing paperwork up on street level. I was still learning where everything went, so there was a lot of to and fro while I figured out the shelving. As I was standing looking through a list, a small pebble was thrown at me, hitting me on my arm. I exclaimed something out of pain and looked around. The head torch I wore lit up areas directly in front of me. I couldn't see anything, but when I looked away, another small pebble hit my leg. This was followed by a low growl, which sounded from my left ear. I made double time to get out of there, nearly running right into my boss, who was more understanding than I expected when I told her what happened. She told me to head up to the bar and she would finish up. That night, I made every excuse to not go down there again. After a couple of months, my boss moved to a new location, and my new boss wasn't as understanding. So far, I'd managed to never be on my own in the vault. There was still activity, but no throwing pebbles or growling. The lights would flicker, the shelves would rattle, and there would be heavy breathing on occasion. But nothing serious, I guess. Under my new boss, this was a no-go. He did not care about whatever stories we'd been telling him, and he didn't believe any of the ghost talk. My job included the vault, and as such, I had no choice. So I endured more growls, thrown objects, glasses breaking in my hands, and even scratches down my back and legs before what turned out to be my final shift the winter before I turned 20. All my enjoyment of that job had been leached out of me by the experiences in that vault. I no longer looked forward to my night shift serving happy drunk people while listening to pounding music. I always dreaded the fact I would have to go to the vault at least twice a week, and I only did 4 shifts a week. This particular night was quite cold. We'd had the first ice of that winter. It was already bad enough, but just after midnight I had to go to the vault. I was pre-warned the stairs were slippery this time of year, and I was told to salt my shoes before I took my first step. I took heed of this warning and followed the instructions, managing to safely make it down into the vault. I was midway through the area when my head torch went out. It wouldn't come back on. I could barely see a thing in the dim lighting, and still had to get the bottles I was sent for. I had just figured out the layout by this time, so I found the bottles, but I froze when the shelving they were on began to rattle right in front of me. Then I felt heavy breathing on my neck, followed by a low growl by my ear. I didn't want to turn around, but that was the only way out from where I was. I carefully stepped backwards until I could see the light from outside shining down the stairs. It seemed miles away from me, but realistically, it would only take me 30 seconds to reach. Slowly, steadily, I walked towards the stairs, while still feeling whatever it was that was literally breathing down my neck. Just before I got to the stairs, I felt a strong, hard push on the center of my back, forcing me to fall and hit the ground, smashing the bottles in the process. I screamed as I fell down, more in shock than fear. But as I got to my feet and went to climb the stairs, I felt something grab onto my jeans leg and tug, making me lose my balance and fall again. Luckily, one of my coworkers had come looking for me, as apparently I'd been gone for a while. He found me on the floor with a cut on my head and ripped jeans surrounded by broken glass and alcohol. I explained what happened through sobs, telling him I was quitting there and then. He couldn't blame me. He told me to head up and get seen by the first aider. I stepped out into the paved area, and my head torch came back on instantly, as if it never stopped working. I found out later that 7 people quit that place in the course of 3 months because of this heightened activity. The owner got wind, and though he said he didn't believe in ghosts, he wanted to keep his staff, so they stopped using the vault to store the alcohol, and while renovating the club, he had space made for the excess alcohol to be refrigerated in-house. I don't know what those vaults were used for, but in daylight, you can still see the chain links in some of them. I never went back to that club, not even for a night out. The horrors of working from home. From Mama Bear 1990. This happened a few months ago when my husband and I were beginning to pack up to relocate our family to a better home. I work from home for a large company, and my husband's mother would usually watch our baby while we worked. We had been renting a home that was split level. For those who don't know what that is, it's a house that has an upstairs and a downstairs, but each level of the house is rented to a different person. Our little family lived in the downstairs unit, and there was a couple who lived above us. Sadly, the wife of the couple had recently died of natural causes. She even passed in the home. I'm by no means a skeptic, and I know that there are things in this world beyond human comprehension that are oftentimes unexplainable. In fact, my mother-in-law is something of a clairvoyant. She dreams of things from the past and the future, and they sometimes come true, especially if she's had the dream more than once. She can also see things that other people can't see. She's told us many times when she first visited that Tanya was still there. Now, ever since the woman upstairs had died there, strange things occurred within our home. Things would go missing, only to turn up in a completely different place in the house. We would hear things that weren't necessarily there, and one of our dogs would often bark for no apparent reason, growling at nothing. So I really didn't have any reason not to believe her when she told us these things. There was a day when my daughter had to stay home with me because my mother-in-law had a doctor's appointment, and she was going to pick the baby up after she was done. At this time, we had a camera in the baby's room, which would notify me on my phone if there was any movement or sound picked up in the range of the camera. In the days where I didn't have to drop my daughter off with her grandmother, I would usually keep the app open on my phone so I could keep an eye on her as I performed my daily tasks at work. At one point, I received a phone call that some movement had been picked up. So the camera app was off, and without thinking about it, since it was not the norm to have the baby home with me while I was working, I set my phone down without the app on. A few minutes later, I received a notification that there was movement captured in the baby's room. So I opened the camera to check. Of course, there was nothing there. Now, I'm not one of those people who automatically thinks ghosts, even with the fact that the woman upstairs died in the house. My first thought was that there was a bug which flew close enough to the camera lens to cause the camera to pick up the movement. Since the baby still looked like she was sound asleep, I put my phone back down, continuing to work without thinking much more of it. Within a few minutes, I heard a baby cry, so I looked at the camera again, and guess what? The baby was still sound asleep on her belly, with her butt sticking up in the air. At this point, I'm thinking that something's going on, so I called my husband at work. I was talking to him about these strange occurrences. While I was on the phone with him, I suddenly heard the baby beginning to scream. All I could hear was, "Mommy, Mommy, Mommy," and every time she called my name, she sounded more and more panicked. I quickly got off the phone with my husband, running into the baby's room to grab her out of the crib. As soon as I opened the door, the baby started pointing at the wall again, and she began to scream "Mommy" at the top of her lungs. Now, like any parent, I know my child. My child is a daredevil like her daddy, and she usually isn't afraid of anything. This was way out of character for her, and it scared me pretty bad. I took her out of her crib and went back into my office, clutching her to my chest. After that, things settled down for a while. I called my mother-in-law and told her about what happened, and how I didn't think that the baby was really safe at our house at that point in time. I called my boss while waiting for my mother-in-law to arrive, and I let her know I'd be offline for a little bit, because there were some issues going on in my house. Thankfully, she was okay with this, so I logged out while I got the baby prepared to go with her grandma. She refused to go back into her room with me while I packed her bag, so I put her in her high chair in the living room with her breakfast and cartoons on the TV. When my husband's mom finally arrived, we discussed it, and she told me that Tanya was not happy that we were leaving because we'd been good neighbors to her. She also said she didn't think it was dangerous for the baby, but me being a mama bear, I did not want to take any chances. We called my husband and father-in-law to discuss it with them, and ultimately, we decided our in-laws would keep the baby until we officially moved out in a week. I packed the baby's bag and sent her with my mother-in-law before going back to work. Even after the baby left, I continued to hear crying coming from her room. My husband and I heard this multiple times, up until we finally moved out of that house at the beginning of July. Since we've moved, we have the same camera set up in the baby's room, and we've had no further problems. I'm not sure if it was Tanya at the old house checking in on the baby, making sure she was okay, or if she was trying to figure out why we were leaving. But if it was her, I hope she finds the peace that she didn't have in this world. I also hope that the people who move into that house after us don't have too many dealings with Mrs. Tanya. My encounter with Longarms. From Milwaukee Pasta Bandit. I should probably preface this little tale with the fact that even after this admittedly bizarre scenario unfolded, I'm still not much of a believer in the paranormal. I know all about the classic skinwalker, Wendigo, shadow people, dogman, etc. And it's all just come across to me as spooky campfire creepypasta stuff, entertaining to listen to and certainly scary while you're all alone at night. But to me it's still just fiction. Maybe I'm ignorant and sheltered from the rest of the world, but for whatever reason, the paranormal has largely eluded me my whole life. Still though, in spite of that statement, it doesn't change the fact that I think I saw something really unusual one early morning back in the summer of 2019. At that point in my life, I was working at a local supermarket between college semesters, part-time during the school year and full-time during the summers. Overall, it was pretty vanilla standard first job experience. Sure, I had my occasional angry customers, shoplifting, and annoying coworkers. But overall, any issues or mishaps had pretty much nothing to do with the supernatural. It was just a normal first job. For about maybe a little under a year, I worked as a bagger, until I was eventually given the illustrious position of General Merchandise Clerk. Basically, a fancy term for the guy who stocks the shelves. Early on in the job, I'd stated I wasn't much of a morning person. And while management honored that for most of my tenure as a bag boy, the week I got promoted, my boss immediately started putting me on the opening shift, which was around 5 a.m. in the morning to 3 in the afternoon. Luckily, the supermarket was only about 10 minutes away from my house, so the drive wasn't too crazy. It was on one of these early shifts that my encounter with this thing happened. I should have known something was off that day, given that I woke up at about 3:30 in the morning for absolutely no reason whatsoever. I really just kind of jolted awake. Not from a nightmare or anything else. I just was awake. Try as I might, I was completely unable to fall back to sleep, and maybe 30 minutes later, I decided to hop in the shower and head off to get an early breakfast, then go to work. I pulled into the parking lot with maybe 20 or so minutes to spare before my shift started. I parked my car in one of the empty spots. Now, the parking area here was not like a Walmart-sized lot or anything, but it was pretty spacious. And in the early morning without sunlight, it does kind of look creepy, almost derelict. There's an entrance to an alleyway off to the side of the store that looks absolutely nefarious in the dark. If any place on that plaza was going to be haunted, it was definitely there. I was parked in the second row about smack dab in the middle of the lot, just vibing, sitting in the car with the heater on, listening to music, when I saw it. It walked out of that haunted as heck looking alleyway I mentioned earlier. I kind of caught it in my peripheral vision, and at first I thought it was just some dude in a white hoodie. I looked up to see the thing in its entirety, only to realize I was looking at something that was very much not just someone out for an early morning jog. What I thought was a white hoodie was actually stark white pale skin draped over a vaguely humanoid frame. It wasn't very tall. I'm about 5'9", and I'm pretty sure I was a head or two taller than this thing. Other than that, I couldn't really make out much detail on it. Thinking back on it now, it kind of looked like one of those wooden dolls people use as a reference for drawing, completely devoid of any noticeable features. No eyes, no ears, no mouth. It was just blank. Its one defining feature being its obscenely long arms. No joke. This thing's arms were so ungodly long, it had to drag them across the ground, the way you might drag someone on a blanket. Hence why I like to call it Longarms. It walked with this sort of weird gait that's hard to describe. The best I can think to compare it to is the way a gibbon walks, kind of a weird shamble. In fact, if I hadn't noticed its lack of fur and, well, face, I might have assumed that's just what it was, perhaps an escapee from a zoo or a private collection. But the more I took in, the more I realized it just wasn't right. I seriously doubt there's any gibbon alive with arms that long, so much so that they drag them across the floor in such a ridiculous fashion. It honestly might have been funny if the thing wasn't pure nightmare fuel. The thing I called Longarms didn't really seem to notice me nor my car. Or if it did, it probably just didn't care. It turned left from the alleyway and began to walk across the lot a good 30 feet or so from where I was. I was completely dumbfounded. Either this was someone with a very elaborate costume stalking around at night trying to get a good scare out of people, or maybe I'd fallen asleep in the car and I was in some sort of hyper-realistic dream. I felt paralyzed. All I could do was just watch the thing, completely frozen like a deer in headlights. All that said, I wasn't exactly terrified. A lot of similar stories I've read from people retelling their accounts with the supernatural or paranormal mention feeling some sort of bad or evil sensation, like the world around them will get all quiet, and they'll feel this creeping sensation of being watched. This was different. The vibe wasn't haunting or scary. The thing didn't suddenly snap its head at me and grin with an obscenely wide, toothy smile, or speak to me in my mother's voice or whatever. For the duration of this maybe 3 to 4 minute encounter, it didn't even seem to care I was there. To further cement the oddity of the situation, at some point or another, a cat, who I'd seen running around the lot a few times beforehand, which I assumed belonged to one of the folks living across the street from the plaza, wandered within about maybe 15 to 20 feet of Longarms and plopped down, just lying there as if this weird aberration that looked like it had clawed its way from another dimension entirely wasn't just standing there. I half expected the thing to reach out with one of its stupidly long arms, pluck the poor kitty up, and throw it into an as of now unseen maw. But it didn't. Instead, it just turned its faceless head to look at the cat, regarding it the way a person might. It even stopped its little shambling act and stood perfectly still as it registered the existence of this new feline arrival. It was honestly funny in a way. Here I was gawking at this thing, while it was gawking at that fat house cat. The entire thing felt like a mildly uncomfortable fever dream. After a while, it seemed as though the creature had enough and began to meander back to that dark alley. Then it was just gone. I don't mean like it was just out of sight. The second it turned that corner, it felt like it had just popped out of reality, like it was a video game character who'd had its source code completely erased. I sat there, just taking in the sheer absurdity of what happened. Work that day was strange, to say the least, going from witnessing that back to my boring everyday job. It was just quite the shift, I'll say. I ended up talking to a friend about a few months down the line. We basically came to the same conclusion, that I was probably suffering from sleep deprivation. Like I said earlier, I'm not a morning person, and I'm not going to pretend that I was ensuring I'd get a proper 8 hours of sleep every night. Either that, or I fell asleep in my car and had some sort of hyper-realistic fever dream. The former explanation has always been my go-to for rationally explaining this bizarre scenario away. Who knows, though? Maybe I actually did see some sort of otherworldly entity manifest outside my work, all for the sole purpose of looking at a cat. I might be a skeptic, but I try not to be too close-minded. Mystery Package Sender from So-Nora. At one point in my life, there was a time in which I lived in a car with my husband and our 2 dogs. At the time, I worked with my husband at a small factory in the middle of nowhere. There were only a handful of employees there, including my husband and I. So it was like a tight-knit family type of environment. While we didn't stay at our work, we still received our mail there. One fine and normal workday, I got a package in the mail from a well-known company. The first thing I noticed about the package was that it didn't come to my legal full first name. Instead, it had a short version of my full legal first name printed on the mystery package. Granted, the name on the package was the name that everyone referred to me by. The first packages that arrived to me were just like off-the-wall things. Things like humane mouse traps, whitening strips for teeth, and some interior lights for your car that matched up with stereo beats. Those first packages arrived sparsely, about once every couple weeks or so, although they soon began to show up with more frequency, working up to every couple of days. It really wasn't the steady flow of the mystery packages that disturbed me. It was the contents of the packages that began to chill me a little. At this point in my story, I'm kind of assuming that by me referring to the packages as mystery packages, you sort of understand I didn't know who was sending said packages. You see, the packages were ordered through the extremely well-known delivery company, so the return address on the label was wherever the company's closest merchandise bay was. That anonymous fact, combined with the other fact that the packages started to get more personal, however, did disturb me. Maybe personal is the wrong word, because they actually became more specific. For instance, at that time, right before I became homeless, I had just acquired a female puppy. One of the first specific gifts that I got in the mail was a pink dog training collar with a remote. After that, we had an issue with Puppy chewing our stuff in the car while we were inside working. It was winter, and she didn't really want to be outside. Lo and behold, I received a wireless camera with remote viewing and intercom. In other words, I could scold my puppy remotely. My husband and I didn't necessarily want to be homeless, like at all, so we stayed in isolated places, without other people around. Knowing this, you should also know that our friend circle was even smaller than our work circle. When I say smaller, I mean like we had only one outside friend outside of work apiece. Which is also why the personal nature of the peculiar gifts started getting to me, especially when they continued. At one point, the defroster in our car didn't work well at all, and it was winter, so the windshield would often ice over. I was both shocked and delighted when I next received an external windshield cover for icy conditions. When sleeping on the hard back end of our tiny car hurt my back, a large, thick, fluffy, queen-sized mattress cover solved the problem. My neck began to ache shortly thereafter, so I welcomed the memory foam neck pillow. Sore tailbone from sitting outside on the hard ground? No problem, because the next package was a memory foam pillow that I received just for my butt. The next twist in the mystery package theme came a little later when the mystery gifts started to gear towards my husband a little. We received a heated beard straightening comb for his unruly beard, and I also received some hair extensions in my husband's favorite 2 colors. Right after the strange gifts, seemingly to my husband, the packages got vague again. I received things like electrode sticky pads for the skin, a teacher's Valentine's Day card kit, and a child's mini-colored rubber band craft set. Day after day, more gifts arrived from my admirer. The mailman brought me some wireless headphones, perfect to drown out the dog whining. A portable charger came next, along with a fast charger USB box and cable. After that, I got 2 pairs of reading glasses that almost fit my rare eye prescription. And thus, to go with the pattern, more nonsensical packages from me. A fluffy yellow ball keychain, paper towel dispenser, automatic sink faucet, and a shower head for an RV. Of course, by that point our coworkers had started a joke that we needed a bug detector to see if maybe our car or something was being bugged. And were we all completely floored when along came a bug detector in the mail as the next mystery package. We did try and check the car with it, but we, unfortunately, I guess, came up empty-handed. After we got the bug detector, though, the mystery packages began to die out. I got a DIY model car building kit for a kid right before my young son's birthday, a pair of water-resistant Bluetooth speakers, and some plastic reusable plates and dish covers, which I did need. The really puzzling part for me was that I never could figure out who sent all these things. I questioned those around me and even checked browser histories for the orders in my friends' tablets, but to no avail. I also had my phone checked for some type of spyware or anything like that, but nothing was found on it. And that's the end of the story, because the packages stopped coming, and I only had one suspect who I had briefly dated prior to getting married, but I could never really prove it. It's been a couple of years now, and as of yet, no more mystery packages. Strangest hiker I've ever met. From River Runs Through It. I used to live in Prince George, a small town in British Columbia's interior. While it is developed, it's very much remote. What you must know is that it's far out of the way, almost entirely surrounded by woods and rivers. After completing my diploma in natural resource management, I scored a position at Wilkins Regional as an assistant ranger. Somehow, this park was the most remote of all, considering it sits a few kilometers downriver from town itself. The job really wasn't too lucrative. It was only a seasonal position, and with minimal pay, though it suited me just fine. Given the nature of the work, it's more than fair to say it can be strange at times. The park during the on-seasons can feel isolationist if nobody's around. When the temperature begins changing and fog sinks in, it can get pretty atmospheric too. And of course, there's no shortage of large wildlife up here. Anything from wild dogs and coyotes to moose that look like darned dinosaurs whenever they're skulking about in low visibility. Mountain lion screeches remain up there with the unholiest of sounds on the planet, but nothing ever happened to me that was really and truly unexplained. Well, aside from the series of events I'm about to share with you. It began quietly. The presence of the local wildlife, like the ones I mentioned previously, died down over the course of 1 week. At first, it started with birdsong beginning later and later in the day, until eventually, there seemed to be none at all. The frequency of us having to negotiate all too friendly wild animals away from hikers and campers seemed to become lower. I remember the day when there was absolutely no animal activity. No sounds, no appearances. This was as the summer was nearing an end. Days were still long, and it was relatively warm. It seemed inexplicable. In juxtaposition to the decline of wild ambience, we had a rise of something else: pet disappearances. It was a common occurrence for individuals to come and walk their dogs, as the park was a great environment for that. There were 1 or 2 times throughout a bi-weekly period in which a canine would break away from their owners to chase down a forest critter. But suddenly we were getting massive amounts of reports of missing dogs on the daily. I remember nearly every single one of them. They would all say the same thing: their dog had been excited by something beyond the trees. They'd broken away from their leash and disappeared into the woods, barking and howling all the while. Throughout the second half of the week, we probably got 15 more cases like that. I can't disclose the recovery rate for them, but it wasn't good. There's only so much we can do for dogs that run off. Of course, with this sort of scale, I had a hunch something was up. I think my supervisor was bothered by it too, but she showed nothing outwardly, and so I tried to not let it get to me. That prelude aside, when I arrived at my position the following week, I met a very interesting character, and I don't say interesting lightly. As you could probably guess, Prince George is a relatively conservative town. During my stay there, it was by no means intolerant, but given the social norms present in such a development, it's easy to tell if someone isn't a local by the way they dress and act. That's why when I saw the guy outside of my posting, I could immediately tell he wasn't from around there. As I approached the building I was stationed at, one near a parking lot and overlooking both the river and two of the three primary trails of the park, I noticed him leaning against the building by the front entrance. He was skinny, like incredibly skinny for a man, with long silver hair that made little sense considering he was young, plus these flowing sleeve tattoos that were crazy in detail. He just had that look, the type to make you think, yeah, that guy is starring in a movie. I could even see they went up his arms and across his chest, only because of his bizarre outfit. It was this open, short-sleeved overcoat that wasn't thick enough to keep in any relevant amount of heat, and that was all for the top at least. No shirt, no gloves, no hat. Half of his upper body was left exposed, and this is something incredibly uncommon for Prince George, because it's cold up there, even in the summer. Even with that, he's wearing some relatively normal dark pants and low tops. You might think that's a strange amount of detail, but he was so bizarrely out of place that I attentively observed him as I approached the door. As I came near, I noticed his attention was diverted to a small book he was reading in one hand. I couldn't tell you what the title was, as he immediately tucked it away as I came closer. Our first interaction began with him smiling, neatly, before greeting me with a, "Hello, Ranger." This I found interesting, firstly because no one's ever just called me Ranger, and secondly because I was bundled up in a large coat for the morning cold, my uniform obstructed, so he couldn't have known for sure who or what I was. But I suppose he could have guessed, since I was approaching the building at such an early hour. Anyway, I greeted him back, asking him what he was doing out so early. Keep in mind, it was just past 6 in the morning at the time, and natural light was next to zero. We were only lit up by a bulb attached to the ranger post. I also make it a point to ask him why he's so underdressed. I remember him specifically dodging the latter question though, instead only opting to answer the former. Like so many park goers the past week, he informed me that he'd lost a pet on one of our trails. I asked him when, but he said he wasn't sure. I remember him saying something along the lines of, "some days ago." Now, as anyone probably would, I found that answer strange. Typically, especially in an area filled with natural predators, if you lost your pet, you would report it to the rangers the day of, rather than waiting an unspecified amount of time. That, combined with this bizarre outfit, his seeming indifference to cold weather, and mannerisms, made me think something was wrong with the guy. I didn't really know what at the time. He didn't appear to be drunk or high as far as I could tell, which was quite the problem up there. He didn't seem threatening either. If anything, he was ironically well-spoken. Still, his story made very little sense. But I did my best not to act on judgment, and so I told him that once I opened the post up, I'd be happy to take a report. He didn't agree to that though. He proceeded to tell me that he would find the animal himself, going on to explain that the only reason he was waiting outside the post was to meet the ranger on duty. Weird, I know. We talked for a while, a quick conversation in which I found out his name was Adam. I remember asking him multiple times about his animal, insisting I file a report, but he refused to tell me anything. It was strange, because it wasn't like he was dodging my questions. More so, it was like he was constructing the conversation to avoid answering me without sounding awkward. Adam was very good at using his words, and they were archaic words too. He was obviously young, but he spoke like an old man, with verbiage you'd think was lost to time. It reminded me of my grandfather in a strange way. Regardless, I did eventually catch on to his reluctance to divulge information. and it tripped further alarm bells that were already primed because of his out-of-place character. As if aware of this, he promptly informed me that he was heading off. He said he enjoyed our conversation and that we'd be seeing each other again soon. He began to walk away before offering me his hand, saying it was a pleasure to meet me. So I shook it, reluctantly. Part of me wanted to insist that he stayed and detail his missing pet, but the off-putting vibe coming from him led me to deciding not to stop him. Instead, I watched as he turned away, starting on his hike down the trail to look for his lost animal, once again producing the strange book from his interior coat pocket. It really was curious, the way he made his way down the trail in the low morning light, with his focus solely on his book, as if he knew perfectly where he was going. My morning duties proceeded after that. I mentioned Adam to my supervisor haphazardly, and they proceeded to give me an earful about how I can refuse the trails to individuals, especially if it's too dark to see where they're walking comfortably. She was right, and in hindsight I should have. But like I said, there was something very odd about the man that made me not want to interfere in his search for his pet. The day goes on, I remember it was our busiest day in terms of animal upset. We're talking upwards of 10 reports. At the end of my hours, my manager sat down with me and one other guy, my coworker with an identically junior role. She told us that she was genuinely concerned there was something causing the disappearance of pets along the trails. Naturally, the two of us were both like, a predator? But she didn't think so. The opposite, actually. She believed there might have been an uncommon late summer boom in the breeding season of rabbits or other small critters, things dogs would especially prey upon, which might have went unchecked by their local wild predators. And we both nodded. The idea made sense, I guess. Earlier that year in the spring months, we also had huge numbers of dogs running off trails, which is typically when you see rabbits in frenzy. So come the next day, me and the other assistant ranger were tasked with a population survey of rabbits and voles. Generally, for this kind of thing, visual observations of the creatures and their burrows worked well, though we also opted for some live trapping. Fortunately, my coworker got stuck with the deployment of those, so I was able to perform the more relaxing duty. After settling my radius, I headed off, and it was fairly uneventful. I followed one of the main trails halfway before branching off onto a coyote path, which cut over to this stream after maybe a kilometer. I'd been out of the post and on the trails quite a lot the past few days because of all the missing pets, but that day the air seemed different, a lot quieter. No bird song, no animals, just the lame buzz of insects. I was actually kind of disappointed. I'm a big fan of bunnies and thought it'd be cool to see a bunch hopping around, as we tend to only see them in the spring. But there were none that day. No voles either. I noted down the lack of regional population as I made my rounds, stopping by the stream to quickly catch my breath. I remember sitting down on this rock that was overlooking the water, plotting where to go next, when I heard this sound behind me. It was a feverish rustle, like an animal sprinting through tall grass. Quickly I turned, only to find nothing there. It was bizarre. As I looked, tall weeds had been parted as if something had been there, yet there was no visual trace of it. At the same time, there was this metallic smell in the air that filled my nostrils almost enough to make me gag. It was as pungent as a mouthful of pennies. Suddenly, I felt eyes on me. It's a feeling that's hard to place if you've ever lived in an area where you have to be careful of natural predators. I knew something was watching me. My mind was thinking cougar, although we hadn't seen evidence of one in the area in some time. So slowly I removed myself from that rock, standing up and flexing my shoulders. Loudly, I cleared my throat, giving a quick spin to make sure I didn't have my back to some creature. But it was weird. My instincts were screaming at me that something was there right behind me, ready to pounce. But I didn't see a thing. I looked and looked. Then suddenly the feeling just vanished, and so did the smell. It just seemed to blink away, no dissipation, no fading out. Just there, then gone. I can't explain what tangible relief it was, as if a giant weight was literally removed from my chest. A sudden sound of someone muttering, "Dang it," caused me to turn once again. I see none other than Adam. He's standing there only 10 or so feet away from me. He was looking past me across the stream. Keep in mind, it's been a day and a half since I last saw him, and he was dressed in the exact same outfit. Still pretty stunned, I asked him what he was doing. He turns to me and gives me a slight smile, before saying, "Hello again, Ranger." Maybe it was the adrenaline pumping through my veins, because I thought I was being hunted seconds earlier, but I didn't really want to play games with him anymore. With an aggressive inflection, I looked at Adam and said that I wanted to know what he was doing, sneaking up on me this far away from the trail. Plainly, he said that he had no intention of sneaking up on me, and rather was trying to catch his pet. But he was too late. He went on to say that his pet had never gone so far as to elude him this long. And do note, he was describing the animal as an it. He complained that he'd be out of time soon, whatever that meant. So of course I'm like, well, if you filed a report, we'd be able to help you out. Then, with another smile, he said something along the lines of, "You've already helped me out tremendously." Then he looked past me over my shoulder once more. First, I thought he was staring at me, but then I followed his gaze, realizing he was looking across the stream in the next tree line, maybe 75 feet away. I see it then too. This large wolf. Now, wolves are bigger than dogs, so it was obvious it was no dog. However, this was bigger than the typical wolf, too. It was black and brown, peeking out from the trees. Maybe, I thought, I couldn't see it properly. It just looked absolutely massive. A dire wolf in every sense of the word. Instantly, I think, this has to be what I felt watching me earlier. I took a step back, keeping my eyes on it. I was scared if I looked away, it was going to come charging at me. As I paced backwards, Adam, with no concern at all, stepped past me, heading towards the animal. Once he passed the rock I was sitting on, the thing turned tail and took off into the woods. I heard him let out an exasperated sigh. With my breath sucked out of me, I managed to ask him if that infernal thing was his pet that he'd been talking about. We met eyes and he said nothing. He then turned away, pacing down past the rock as if he was going to cross the stream. So I looked on, watching him wade through the stream in his pants that were no doubt getting soaked. I quickly turned around, walking back to my post. I didn't know what to think of that interaction. Even to this day, I still have the mental image of that wolf staring at me across the way. I've only had to deal with a predator on 2 other occasions, and the way that animal looked at me was nothing like anything I've ever experienced. Even weirder than Adam himself. I didn't know what to think. What the heck was he doing going after that huge animal? I don't even recall how I rationalized it at the time. I think I convinced myself that what I'd seen was in fact a household dog, one of monstrous size somehow. But deep down I knew that that creature was not a domestic dog. In denial like I was, I didn't have the thought to report the animal, nor did I bother informing either my manager or my coworker what had transpired. Instead, I decided to take the day, because the anxiety from the situation turned into debilitating nausea that ensured I was not going to work comfortably. My manager was upset, namely because she had to take over my surveying duties, but she understood nonetheless. My shift had altered times on each Tuesday of the week. The next day I arrived at just past noon. The park was closed down for guests. The parking lot was largely closed off, with a few site-closed signs that I hadn't ever deployed myself in all my time there. When I entered the post, I was greeted by the other rangers, who informed me that the park trails had been shut down for the time being, in accordance with the extreme number of pet disappearances. I asked my manager how the survey went. She said that was the thing. She went on to tell me that, like I'd witnessed in my brief profile, she didn't find a single element of expected life. No predators, and no prey, let alone the dogs that hikers had lost. I could tell she was a little freaked out, and she continued to say that she hadn't seen an event like this since she started her career over a decade ago. She then told the both of us that she didn't have much of an idea what sort of event could be causing the disappearance of wildlife. Her new theory then was that it was something to do with ultrasonic machinery. In a nutshell, some local man-made installation going up nearby the park produced sounds which upset the animals and drove much of them out. Didn't make much sense to me, especially considering how far off we were from the city center. But I couldn't come up with anything better, and so we rolled with it. She said that she had requested an ecologist to come in, but they had to fly in from a neighboring city, and it would be a few days. In the meantime, the only duties we had were to walk up and down our park borders, searching for signs of any animal life, even though we all seemed to know there wasn't going to be any. An idea that was driven home by the fact that some of the previous day's live traps had already been checked, and they'd all come up empty. So my coworker and I set out to tackle an area that went untouched from previous day's work. If my supervisor's theory regarding an ultrasonic disturbance was correct, it was unpredictable just how far it could extend, and so we were checking the very edge of the park. The post had 2 UTVs, effectively rugged golf carts, attached to the location, and we both hopped into one. Now, I was still on edge from the bizarre encounter from the day before, but the sun was high in the sky, and the day was unreasonably warm, so I was feeling confident. My coworker, meanwhile, made it apparent that the lack of animals and disappearing pets was making him feel really freaked out. As we entered the vehicle, he explained he thought there was a poisoned water supply somewhere, and how he couldn't wait to get the ecologist in to make an assessment. I couldn't confirm or deny his theory. I did want to discuss Adam a little, though, and so without mentioning specifics, I asked him if he had met any odd characters on the park trail. As he drove, he didn't take his eyes off the road, but he did ask, "Like who?" I went on to describe how I'd seen Adam a few times in the park. I forced a laugh as I told him about the weird encounter, but I didn't bring up the wolf. Not yet. As I finished, my coworker paused for a moment, stopping the acceleration of the UTV so we could better hear each other. He then admitted he had seen Adam too. He went on to tell me that the day prior, apparently coinciding just after my run-in with him by the stream, which seemed impossible because my coworker was on the exact opposite side of the park, almost 40 minutes away on foot, Adam had appeared behind him suddenly as he was deploying a trap, before saying something that made no sense. My coworker described it as Shakespearean. He asked Adam what he was doing out there, and he said he was simply hiking, trying to find his lost pet. My coworker says that he felt there was something off about the guy, more so than the bizarre outfit and tattoos. I said I knew what he meant, and he went on to describe it perfectly. It was like he was displaced, both in location and era. His speech was outdated and old, just like it had been with me, and he'd pull quotations out of nowhere from people my coworker could not recognize. He continued with his story, telling me that wasn't the weirdest part. He said that when he asked Adam about what kind of pet he was looking for, and whether he'd file a report, their conversation was interrupted by an insanely loud, ear-splitting howl. Even though it sounded canine, he was convinced it was a mountain lion because of the volume and ferocity. He immediately assessed his position, looking around and seeing nothing. Meanwhile, Adam didn't lose his relaxed demeanor. He said something along the lines of, "Sounds close by, doesn't it? I'd best be going then." And he strolled away, leaving my coworker alone in the park with his traps. Of course, after hearing that, I interjected, talking about the wolf I saw at last, which Adam all but said was his pet. My coworker was like, "So, some freaky tatted up dude dressed in shambles is chasing his pet timber wolf around our park." I chuckled a bit, It was relaxing because I had the whole thing wrapped up in my head, but discussing it with my coworker made me feel so much better about it. But still, it was weird. We began to theorize if Adam and his pet were somehow related to the disappearances of the local wildlife, but we could not come up with anything concrete. The way we both had near identical experiences with the guy was beyond odd. My coworker begins to drive again. We arrive at the edge of the park. Not a lot happened though. We didn't see Adam again, nor did we see any animal of any kind. Eerie quiet seemed to permeate every single space in the forest, save the few flying insects that buzzed around. There were simply no animals, no droppings either. At one point, we did find a burrow that, from the size of it, was likely housing a fox at one point, but no occupant was present. After surveying and noting down as much as we could, not that there was much to note down at all, we returned to the UTV, making our way back to the office. When we returned, we informed our manager of the lack of activity and turned in our reports. She was disappointed, informing the both of us that, with the park closed down, we could take the rest of the day off if we wanted to. Of course, we both did. After all, the park had become so creepy with the absence of life. That night was boring, and I went to bed early. Come morning, I texted my supervisor, wondering if she needed me to come in that day. She didn't respond right away. When it was nearly time to leave, she still hadn't let me know, and so I decided to go ahead anyway. I got there despite all the closed signs being up. I noticed a car parked outside my post, a police car of all things. I get there to find my coworker already talking to an officer. There's this smell, absolutely awful coppery stink in the air, which I wrinkled my nose at. My coworker gives me this look, and I immediately know something has happened. So the cop re-explains what he was saying to the other ranger. Tragic story short, our manager had been in that morning and was mauled by a wild animal. The officer didn't tell us what animal it was, though the implication was a cougar. Of course, we're both caught off guard, super freaked out. At that point in time, she was in bad condition and had already been transported to the local hospital after making the call to authorities herself, which was darned impressive. He tells us that within the next few hours, wildlife control would be up there to find the thing. After a bit more, the officer left. Of course, I'm heartbroken, but at the same time I'm puzzled. Her being attacked by a cougar seemed to imply animals were in the area, which was entirely the inverse to everything we'd seen the past few days. The two of us stuck around, waiting for the authorities to show up. We wanted to know how they were planning to trap the thing. I wasn't really sure, but we both remained in case our assistance was required. Since the attack happened so close to the post, we were expecting them to capture and euthanize it. I remember finishing my first cup of coffee that morning when the front door to the post opened. My coworker, who was just outside the post, came in with a bewildered look on his face. He looked at me. Immediately, I knew something was wrong, so I stood up. He informed me that Adam was outside, and he had a friend. Together, we headed outside of the post. There he was. He sat casually a few meters away from the post, seated neatly on grass just bordering the parking lot. What shocked both of us was that next to him was this puppy. The thing was tiny and obviously quite young, though it bared an eerie resemblance to the wolf I'd seen previously, with its jet black fur and brown highlights. It stirred as if waking from our presence and glared at me with these intense eyes that were identical to those from that large animal. Seeing us, Adam approached, tugging on a black rope that I'd only just then realized was leashed around the small animal. He smiled at us, and before either of us had a chance to speak, he began. "I apologize about the trouble, Rangers. I finally caught my pet and we shall be leaving." And so seeing the little dog, we're both like, "That's the pet you meant?" But he ignored us before going on. "I'm sorry about the woman. The distraction was everything I needed. Rest assured she will recover. We knew he was referring to our manager. We asked for clarification, but he waved his hand and went on. The wildlife should return swiftly. I wish the both of you luck in your duties, and thank you once again for your assistance. He turned to leave then, and we both looked at each other puzzled, wondering if we should go after him. I kid you not, the moment I took a step forward, rain fell. The most instantly harsh rain I'd ever seen. Like all at once, the air switched from relatively dry humidity to thundering sheets of rain. Quickly, we both stepped back a few feet, hiding under the awning, and as we did, I saw Adam, who wasn't at all fazed by the rain. He turned back and waved at us once more before continuing down the path, one leading into the woods, mind you, not back to town. I never did see Adam again. I'm happy to report my manager made a full recovery, though she did end up quitting shortly after. Fast forward a few weeks after that, and I'd quit too. The park animals did come back, just as Adam said they would. Over the course of a few days, all the natural wildlife I'd come to expect grew populous again. Unfortunately, we didn't see too many of those household pets come back. Suffice to say, Adam will remain the strangest hiker I've ever met. Tales from the Break Room is a viewer-submitted podcast featuring allegedly true scary stories that happened on the way to, on the way from, or at work. If you want your story to be narrated on the show, send it to us at eriecast.com/submit. As of April 14th, we're paying 3 cents per word for stories that are approved and make it onto the show. Submission does not guarantee approval or payment. For a limited time only, PayPal only. Tales from the Break Room is an EerieCast Network original podcast hosted by Darkness Prevails. You can follow him on Twitter at Dark Prevails, and you can hear thousands more stories read by him on our other show, Unexplained Encounters. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow and rate Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can also enjoy plenty more horror-themed podcasts at eriecast.com.